The 10 short-term rental cash flow commandments. Now, I'll be the first to admit that these aren't nearly as good as the original 10, but much like the original 10 that my main man Moses presented that were sort of a guide to a better life, these are 10 commandments that are a guide to a better short-term rental. A better cash flowing short-term rental. And if you find a deal that violates a few of these principles, it's not like that deal is going to be bad necessarily. But what I've found over the years, if you can stack as many of these principles or commandments as possible, the better cash flowing deal you're probably going to end up with. So with that being said, let's dive into the 10 short-term rental cash flow commandments. Starting with number 1, thou shalt not purchase a single source of income. So what most people do when it comes to short-term rentals is they focus primarily on single-family homes. And in some cases, these can work well. However, what I've found is that if you purchase in the right area, typically a non-mainstream short-term rental market, you can often find multi-unit or multiple unit properties, be it a duplex or triplex, or even a creative multi-unit like a finished basement, a finished garage, a pool house in the back, a tree house that you can rent, but multiple streams of income coming in on one property. And this makes a massive difference because if you can buy a multi-unit for around the same price point as a single family home, and one of those units brings in close to what you could have brought in with the single family home, that means that every other unit worth of income is almost pure profit because it doesn't change your expense profile. So if you can find a 3-unit where 1 unit worth of income is very similar to the single family home, now you have 2 more units worth of profit, which basically is all cash flow piled on top of that first unit. So the cash flow difference with a multi-unit compared to a single family home in a lot of cases is massively higher. Commandment number 2 is to buy near a population center. Notice I said buy near and not in a major population center. By buying close by, you get the benefit of all the reasons that people travel because of other people. So there's business reasons, there's weddings, there's funerals, there's family visits, there's all these inherent reasons that people travel because of other people. If you buy in a remote area, the only reason people travel to a remote area typically is to get away. So you don't get all of those other bookings as a result of all those reasons, people traveling to a major population center. The other benefit of this is that if you buy just outside of the major population center, typically price points can be a half or a third of the cost in the major population center. So you get all the upside, but yet your costs are a lot lower. Commandment number 3 is to target a short-term rental that provides a 1% net cash flow. So what I mean by this is that whatever you pay for a property, the property should provide, after all your expenses on a monthly basis, it should provide 1% of what you pay for it. And so there's the old 1% gross rule that most people use for long-term rentals, but I've updated that for short-term rentals, and I go by the 1% net rule because I want to know what's left over that I can stick in my pocket as net profit every month after all my expenses. And if you can hit 1%, then that's a really good cash flowing deal. So for example, if you buy a property for $200,000 and say it's a multi-unit property and it's bringing in say $5,000, $6,000 a month gross, then you take out all your expenses and there's $2,000 left over, then that's a 1% net type of deal. And typically it's very difficult to do that with a single family home or a condo unit, but with a small multi-unit, it's very doable. Commandment number 4 is that the deal must not only work well as a short-term rental, but it must also cash flow as a long-term rental if you were ever to use it that way. There are a lot of people today, especially in this higher interest rate environment, that are justifying the purchase of a short-term rental because they can eke out a little bit of cash flow there, knowing that if they ever had to convert this property to a long-term rental because of another COVID lockdown or rule changes or any of the many reasons that could come up, and you need to use it as a long-term rental as a backup option, you're going to have a lot of negative cash flow in that situation. But they say, well, that's not likely, so I'm still going to buy these short-term rentals that would never work as long-term rentals. I don't like to play that game. I think it's a very dangerous way to build a business because it might work for one property and you might be able to swing it for one property. If you converted it to a long-term rental and you had some negative cash flow, you might be able to cover that. But if you start building a portfolio of all these properties that if you converted all of them because of another another COVID lockdown or rule change into long-term rentals, and they all had negative cash flow, now all of a sudden you've got to shell out thousands and thousands of dollars on a monthly basis just to stay afloat. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. I sleep well at night knowing that every one of my properties would work great as a long-term rental as well. Commandment number 5 is to maximize your busy season peak pricing. So most of you are probably familiar with long-term rentals, and with long-term rentals, you have the same fixed rent amount every single month throughout the year. And that can feel good, it can feel safe. And so unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they take that same mentality and they transfer it over to the short-term rental industry. And they say, well, my property is a $200 a night property, and that's what I'm gonna ask every single night throughout the entire year. And unfortunately, the sad reality is that there's probably only a few nights throughout the entire year that $200 a night price point is actually accurate. You might average $200 a night, or it might be on average a $200 a night property, but that doesn't mean every night should be $200. By dynamically pricing or lowering your price when demand is lower and increasing your price when demand is higher, you maximize your revenue so much better. For most people who buy short-term rentals, you're gonna have some seasonality. And for most people, you're going to make all of your profit in the peak season. And so by pricing at $200 a night in the slower season, you're not getting nearly as many bookings because you're priced too high. And in the high season, we have some properties where we're priced nearly 10 times or more than 10 times the amount on 4th of July weekend than we are on a Tuesday in January. So if we were to just set our price at one nightly rate throughout the entire year, we would be leaving a massive amount of profit on the table when demand is super high and supply is much lower. And that's when you make all your profit. So when you calculate your cash flow at the end of the year, people who price at one nightly price or don't understand this supply and demand dynamic, they'll tend to say, well, this short-term rental thing doesn't work that well. It's not providing very good cash flow. And you have to realize you're going to make almost all your profit in the busy season. So you have to understand how to price at the top end of that price point when the getting's good. Before I dive into cash flow commandment number 6, I just want to mention that this strategy, short-term rentals, has literally changed my life. It's changed my family's financial future. We started back in 2017 with a short-term rental in our basement, and then we realized the amazing cash flow potential of that, and we started scaling it. And it allowed me to, a few years later, leave my full-time job. My wife and I both have so much more flexibility and autonomy in our lives, and now we work with other people to help them do the same thing. So we work with people individually to walk them through this process and help you buy your first high cash flowing short-term rental very step by step. So if that's a program that sounds like it'd be interesting to you, you can set up a call with me at livingoffrentals.com/call. There's a few questions there, and then you get access to my calendar. You can set up a call with me. We can talk about the program. We can talk about your goals and see if it's a good fit. That said, cash flow commandment number 6 is to avoid big city bureaucracy. I used to live in the city of Chicago. That's where I invested for many years before I understood this philosophy and this whole strategy. And looking back, we went through all the deals that we did downtown Chicago, and each one of them turned out to be much, much less profitable than we initially anticipated. And when we looked at the reasons why, it all went back to big city bureaucracy. It wasn't the deal itself. It wasn't the home itself or the property itself. A lot of them were great properties, but once we calculated in the time that it took to get the permit, the person that we had to pay to push the permit through the process, all the different inspectors that were involved. Every single time we had an inspection, it was a different inspector that came out. All the taxes, all the fees, all the regulation. It made that deal, which would have been a good deal without all of that extra bureaucracy added on top, it made it a much, much worse deal. And it's been very different since we moved out here to Northwest Indiana, where there just isn't the level of big city bureaucracy that we have to deal with. So often you can use the big city bureaucracy to your advantage, because this is where they have the most restrictions on short-term rentals, the most rules. It's the most difficult place to invest in short-term rentals. But just outside of that city, again, you can capitalize on all the population benefits, but yet you're not having to deal with all that bureaucracy or all the restrictions. So if you're next to a city that's highly restrictive on short-term rentals, buying just outside, there's no decrease in demand because they have these high restrictions. There's still just as much demand. They've just decreased supply artificially. So now there's all this spillover demand of people that will book your property just outside of the big city bureaucracy, and you capitalize on all the upside of next door having all that big city bureaucracy. So I'm sure there's people that don't agree with this, and if you're an example of someone who owns in a big city and it's going swimmingly and you are making killer cash flow, please let me know in the comments, because I like to understand other people's strategies as well. This has just been my experience over many, many years of investing. Commandment number 7 is to respect the ratio. So what's the ratio? So if you're interested in cash flow, the ratio that you should start to become obsessed with is where is the place where it has the most favorable income to expense ratio. So you can go to airdna.co and you can look up the average nightly rate and the average occupancy for a specific area. And that's essentially your income. You can calculate what the annual income will be on average in that area. Then you can go over to realtor.com, or you can just Google what's the average cost of a property in any area. And so what you're looking for is a place where that ratio is highly in your favor. And these places do exist. The nightly rate and occupancy and the purchase price do not go up and down in tandem. Most people think intuitively that if it's an expensive place to live and buy a property, then it must be a high nightly rate and occupancy as well, but that's not the case. So what you're looking for, again, is areas just outside of those larger cities where there's local draws that cause that nightly rate and occupancy to go up, because there's, again, demand there. Might not be as much supply there because it's not a huge city, but yet the purchase price is pretty low because it's an affordable area. So if you can find a place where nightly rate and occupancy is high on average and purchase price is low on average, you've just found yourself a great ratio where the cash flow is most likely going to be really, really high. Cash flow commandment number 8 is that you should know exactly what a property will make before you buy. I get the question all the time, what if I buy a property and then it doesn't book up or it doesn't rent out? How do I know that I'm not buying something that's going to be a huge financial burden? You really need to do a deep dive to understand what the comparable Airbnb properties in that market or short-term rental properties are bringing in on a regular basis and how often they book out. And so you can do an analysis of all the comparable properties around that property to really get a good idea of what you can expect. If you're going to bring a similar type of property, your performance should mirror many of the comps right around there. If you put your property address into Airbnb and there's no comps around it that pop up, or maybe there's a whole bunch of comps over on this side of the town, but yours has 0 around it, that's a really bad sign. That's a sign that there might not be a demand there. There might be some problem. There might be a restriction in that area. And so I don't want to be a trailblazer anywhere where there's no other comps that are telling me exactly what I can expect to make. Because if there's other comps right around it that are showing you there's a history of 100 reviews that are all top reviews that people love this area, they love this type of property, and I'm buying something similar, I know exactly what I can expect to make on that property. We're getting close to the end here. Cash flow commandment number 9 is to buy in the path of progress. And this is somewhat related to cash flow, but if you want to buy the holy grail of investment properties, then buy one that adheres to that 1% net cash flow that I talked about earlier. But buy one also, not only does it adhere to the 1% net cash flow, but it's also in the path of progress. What a lot of people do, and I hear this all the time, people say, well, the market's going up. It's gone up 10%, so it's going up. And what they really mean is it has gone up, but that doesn't mean that it's going up. What it's done in the past doesn't necessarily dictate what it will do in the future. Sometimes it's an indicator, but sometimes it's not. And so what a lot of people do is they're drawn toward places that have already appreciated. They're buying in these places that are already the top places. They don't have as far to improve as maybe some of these places that are in the path of progress. Maybe they still have some challenges that they're working toward or working through, but all the pieces are in place for higher future values. You know, there's new infrastructure going in. Schools are improving. Maybe crime's lowering. The policy and decision making is getting better, and that's causing more people to move in. It's causing new amenities to be created, new attractions for people that they want to visit, and that in turn over time is going to cause a lot of appreciation. So if you buy a property there, you're getting it today inexpensively. You can get that 1% net cash flow, and then it's in the path of progress. So 20 years from now, it's going to be worth 2-3 times as much, and you're capitalizing on all that upside while you've collected all the cash flow in the meantime. Finally, cash flow commandment number 10 is thou shalt not get started. See what I did there? It's It's a double negative. I know that, and I'm okay with it. I have this conversation with people all the time where they tell me, are you sure now is a good time to get started? And typically that conversation comes after they've seen some headline that says that the market's about to crash. And so they're asking me, what's the market going to do? Like, I can predict what the market's going to do. If you think anyone can predict what the market's going to do, they're probably trying to sell you something. So I went back and I pulled up real estate headlines for the last 10 years, because if you would have invested 10 years ago, you'd be in a really good position. Even if you didn't buy something that was that great of a deal, just by the nature of holding it for 10 years, it'd be worth a whole lot more today. So I went back 10 years ago and I started Googling real estate headlines every year for the last 10 years. And miraculously, I saw very similar stories every year for 10 years, for the last 10 years. Even though it was a great time to be investing, there were stories every year. Yeah, the market's gone up, but the bubble's about to pop. Interest rates are about to go sky high. Things are going to get really bad in real estate. And that literally was every single year. So if you're asking, what's the market going to do? I can't predict what the market's going to do, but I can tell you that if you buy based on sound fundamentals, again, i.e. the 1% net cash flow, buying in the path of progress, buying just outside of these large cities, all the things I just went over, and the cash flow makes a ton of sense today, who cares what the market's going to do? In the short term, it's going to go up and down. Long term, 20, 30 years from now, you're going to be sitting on an asset that's probably paid off by all your guests at that point. It's probably worth 2 or 3 times as much, and you probably collected several $1,000s a month every single month in the meantime. So if you've been thinking about this a while but not actually investing in a property, then I'd encourage you to actually get started. And if I can help you with that, you can set up a call with me at livingoffrentals.com/call, and we can talk through program and see if it's a good fit for your goals. Thanks for joining me for this video. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.